Welcome to the Michigan in Focus podcast, powered by the Center Square. I'm Bruce Walker, Great Lakes Regional Editor of the Center Square News Wire Service. Michigan in Focus is a production of America's Talking Network. You can find all of the Center Square's great podcasts at americastalking.com. And we ask you to subscribe to Michigan in Focus wherever you listen to your podcast. We're recording today on Thursday, January 19th, 2022. We're almost at the end of the month. And joining me today is Michigan correspondent Scott McClallen and the Center Square's editor-at-large, which is not a comment on his size, Tom Gantert. Welcome, gentlemen. How are you?
Doing good.
Terrific. Awesome. Well, listen, let's just kick right into this. And Scott, you published a story yesterday on Wednesday that in which you discussed that the state is recognizing and could possibly recognize even more of a loss of tax revenue due to electric vehicles. But wait a minute. I thought electric vehicles were the most amazing thing since sliced bread. What's going on?
Yeah, so as the number of electric vehicles grows in Michigan, so does the revenue hole from missing gas taxes that fix roads. So because electric vehicles charge instead of hitting up a gas station, the state is losing out on that revenue, which is used to repair roads.
Well, because I can't afford an electric vehicle, explain to me, when you recharge your electric vehicle and you do so at a place other than your own garage, is that measured and do you pay for that?
Yes. Yeah, it depends, but typically you do pay for it. But there's no taxes on that. So you pay for the energy, but there's no form of a gas tax with electricity, at least not yet.
Okay. Well, explain to me why what is in the process of becoming right now in terms of legislators in Lansing to perhaps maybe, because we like to hear individual legislators say things about people need to pay their fair share.
Yeah, this group, the Coalition of Electric Vehicle and Transportation Revenue, says that lawmakers need to replace this lost funding because additionally, electric vehicles are also heavier than regular vehicles. So it's kind of a twofold deal. So electric vehicles tear up roads more and they pay less to repair those roads. So right now, there's only about 25,181 electric vehicles registered in the state, but the state is expecting that number to grow a lot by 2030.
Well, I suspect that Tom would probably have a little bit of pushback on that assertion. I mean, yes, they do create a disproportionate impact on roads because of their weight, but because there's so few of them, it's not really the electric vehicles that are causing roads to deteriorate in a more quick fashion because, well, let's face it, we have one of the heaviest weight limits for semi-trucks here in the state of Michigan.
I would say, to me, this is by far the least convincing issue with electric vehicles. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing you're using less gas. Using less gas means the price goes down, okay, for us. So we save money. I think the concern over the loss of revenue is like, Bruce, you might remember this, 2019, Whitmer proposed a 45-cent gas tax.
Yes.
Right?
After saying that she wasn't going to do that at all when she was running for the election against Bill Schuette.
Right. Then she puts out a budget with that 45-cent gas tax, and we find out that the McClallen Center went and did some math and found out that 40% of that proposed revenue from the gas tax would not go to roads at all. Okay. It was going to be used to replace current transportation budget dollars that would then be redirected to pay for other government spending. So if whatever is lost from EVs, if the state wants to fix the roads, they'll find the money. They have the money. It's not this idea that any time there's a drop in revenue to the state that they, have to raise taxes is disingenuous. So I would say good. I think it's a good thing that there's less gas, because that means the demand for gas is going to go down, and that saves us. The bigger problems with electric vehicles, what we've been preaching about it. They're too costly, too expensive, and they don't have the infrastructure for normal people living around the state to use.
Well, plus that, one has to look where the energy is generated in order to fill up electric vehicles at the end of the day. I mean, you're still burning coal and natural gas for that.
Right. I'm going to talk over you.
Okay, well, that's what you do.
Can't we all agree electric vehicles are good if they just get the price down? They can do it without subsidies from taxpayers, and they get infrastructure so every person can do it. It's a good thing. The problem I have with electric vehicles is that they're so costly, and we're all paying for people in one way or another to ride them when we don't have the benefit.
Okay, well, I'm going to give you a little bit of pushback here, Tom, without talking over you. And I'm going to say there is a list of pros, and there is also a list of cons. And Scott has written quite a bit. And I come from a long background of writing for the automotive industry. So when the EV market was nascent, I was pretty much there writing about it. And Scott has done a yeoman's job in covering some of the environmental and moral hazards involved with electric vehicles. And so I'm going to flip the mic over to you, Scott, so you can enlighten us.
Well, flip it back to me.
Okay, I'll flip it back to you, and then Scott can have a rebuttal.
So here's my question to you. Do you think electric vehicles are worse for the environment than gas-powered vehicles?
I'm not even sure how we would measure that.
Yeah, and I agree with Scott. I think that there needs to be a study that is peer-reviewed that would actually examine which is actually better for the environment. Okay, there are less emissions from the actual vehicles themselves, but there are also environmental hazards for mining the necessary metals to build the batteries for EVs. And then you have to fill them up. So you have to recharge these vehicles. And where does that energy come from? And you can't tell me that there are no emissions for creating the energy to recharge EV batteries.
Okay, but I just think it's a better deal. The problem to me is the obstacles with cost.
The cost is definitely a factor. Also, when the cars puke out, because there's eventually going to be a time where you have to either pay $20,000 to have a new battery put in your vehicle, or you're going to junk the car, because there are still going to be automobile accidents and cars will be totaled. What do you do with these batteries that seem to spontaneously combust when nobody's looking? And then once you put them out, you think that you put them out, they will reignite.
I think that one of my biggest problems with electric vehicles is that, especially with young people, I'm not going to pay $65,000 for a depreciating asset.
But, the federal government is still putting money on the hood of every electric vehicle sold. So
like $10,000 less? I'm not going to pay $50,000 for a depreciating asset either. So that's where we're at.
You young people are so selfish. You need to readjust your priorities, Scott.
I'll work on it.
Okay. So listen, Tom, you have anything else to offer on this? Oh, okay. All right. Well, let's move along then. And next story is there was the Supreme Court yesterday, which was January 18th, heard arguments on a Sturgis, Michigan case. And it's kind of interesting, and it's education related, and we do cover education topics. So essentially what the story involves is the testimony was related to Perez versus Sturgis Public Schools. And Sturgis is kind of up north on the eastern side off of 75. And the issue is whether the immigrant family of a deaf former student may sue the Michigan Public School District for monetary damages. And this all goes back to their son, Miguel Perez, who came to the school as a 9-year-old from Mexico, and he's deaf, and they gave him an assistant to help him, a classroom aide, but they never brought in a sign language interpreter or someone to actually teach Miguel how to do sign language. So they're essentially suing over that, because at the end of the day, he goes all through grade school, middle school, and high school, and mere weeks before he was to graduate, the school notified the parents that he would receive a certificate of completion rather than a high school diploma. So they sued. They sued the Michigan Department of Education, and under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Rehabilitation Act. So they settled before there was a hearing, and so when they came back for monetary damages, when they settled under the IDEA Act, what they were given was they enrolled him in a school for the deaf, and they gave him some other educational options and what have you. So they considered that to be settled, but the court, the 6th District Court, and the Sturgis Public Schools argued that having done that basically relieved the school district from paying any type of monetary damages. So that's what the Supreme Court is trying to determine right now.
Let me add some numbers to this.
Yes, please do. Please do.
So Sturgis has had 2,991 students, 2021-22, and 578 total employees working. In this country, there's an estimated 300,000 students that are hard of hearing, and 54 million students in public and private schools. So if you do the math, statistically, there are no hard of hearing students. It's 0.000, whatever, however far you want to go down. So how do you deal with a situation that is so rare that it statistically does not happen?
Well, and it's not as if Sturgis is a major metropolitan area either.
Yeah, I think eventually what you have to do when those kind of students come in is try and figure out a partnership with an association to help, and see if you can get it done that way.
Well, I think also what would have been helpful is if, number one, the parents, the son is deaf, the parents probably, and I'm making a terrible assumption here, but probably did not speak English all that well. I don't think that they were presented with all of their options. So being in Sturgis and having a deaf child and not being a native English speaker, probably things got a little bit harried and confused. And so they weren't presented with options of saying, okay, we can send him to the school for the deaf and from the get-go, or at least let the parents know that their child was not on track to receive a high school diploma. He was just going to receive a certificate of completion.
Yeah, all these things that you bring up are the responsibility, in my opinion, of the school. It's the district's job to tell the parents what they have available. They know. The students and teachers, the students' parents do not.
Right. So
there was a failure on the administrative part of the school district not to address this. And then there's the communication issue where you drop the bomb on the parents, so soon before graduation when almost nothing can be done. Also, I don't know the answer to this. Is there a school for deaf in Sturgis?
Not in Sturgis, no.
So how far do you have to drive to get your kid an education? Okay.
Lansing, there's a school. I live in Flint, and we have a school for the deaf here.
Right. So Lansing to Sturgis is what is that? It's an hour and a half ride, I want to say. I'll do the math right now.
That's why we have our intrepid reporter, Tom Gantert, here, so he can do the math for us.
It is 17 hours, 16 minutes. So that's Sturgis, North Dakota.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Well, and
about
that's
an hour
only
and a half.
that's if you ride a motorcycle.
95 miles,
right.
an hour and 32 minutes. That's a heck of a commute, gentlemen.
Yes, it is.
Because your school district doesn't want to do something that's, fairly. And if you know anything about students with special ed, which I do,
as do I,
they make plenty of
concessions and
concessions for single students in school districts. This is a situation that should have been addressed by the school district early on. It's something he's going to live with his whole life, and how it became this is just in my opinion, mishandling of the school district.
Remarkably, there was one other deaf student in the school, and neither one of them could speak sign language with one another, nor could the teacher's aide, speak sign language. So they made up their own language where they would just, make gestures and try to communicate.
Kind of like
things.
We do?
Yes, exactly. I really don't like that gesture you're making right now, Tom. And I'm going to ask you very politely to stop. So, and I joke, but it's still a very serious matter because I was born deaf, and I spent the better part of my youth without the faculty of hearing. So it makes things somewhat problematic. But I had no teacher's aid, and I never learned how to sign. It was all just gesturing or lip reading. So I did a lot of that. So anyway, let's move along. What is our next topic, gentlemen? What do we have here? I think it's going to go back to Mr. McClallen to talk about his story about the bill to put taxpayers on the hook for $4 million for a private company. And I guess that's not really a story because we write about this all the time because the Michigan Economic Development Corporation is, handing out money like it's popcorn. But this is one where the legislators did it without benefit of the MEDC. And I guess the eventual recipient wanted more like $8 million, but, settled for the $4 million that they did receive. So, Scott, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so during a $1 billion overnight spending spree, the GOP-led legislature gave $4 million to a for-profit company with an unclear return on investment for taxpayers. The details of the corporate handout weren't discovered until months later. But the funding flowed to a mobile cardiac imaging venture called Corazon Imaging. The company was formed in March of 2022, and just months later, in July, received $4 million as part of the $76 billion budget. Former House Speaker Jason Farwell sponsored the grant meant to provide...
Wentworth. That would be Jason Wentworth from Farwell.
Oh,
yes.
Sorry about that. Yeah. The grant was meant to serve underserved populations for like cardiac health and scans.
Okay, so what is the are we supposed to be shocked and dismayed by this? Should we be shocked and dismayed by this?
I mean, it was $4 million out of $1 billion of very similar spending that many lawmakers said they weren't even aware about. Oftentimes, these were projects in lawmakers' own districts. But no, we should not be surprised.
Here's why we care. First of all, it's not right. Okay, taxpayers should not be subsidizing private businesses, in my opinion. That's a private venture. We don't share in the profits. So why should we share in the cost? Secondly, as you pointed out, Bruce, this happens everywhere. Not only the Michigan the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, the MEDC does this, but how about all those end of the year budgets where everybody's, those Christmas light omnibus budgets where theaters and nonprofits, all of them get millions of dollars stuck in the end of the year bill. And it's the exact same thing. If you're offended by this, which I think you should be, because it's connected people. That's what this is. Okay. The regular Joes never get $4 million handed to them. It's always the people who are somehow connected to the power brokers. And here it's the legislature. Other times it's the MEDC, and other times it's lawmakers, which would be the legislature. But I mean, that to me is what I don't like, is that this is connected people getting benefits that other people in the same field of work do not get, because they're not buddies or they don't have a connection. In this instant, weren't the owners of the company high executives in the hospital industry? Of course they were. It's like if a nurse or a paramedic came up with this idea, they're on their own. And that I guess that's the problem I have, is that this is a good old boys network. It's what's favored. Yeah. And I see this in my town where I live, where, what is, deemed to be popular, an old theater that should have been torn down decades ago, the Michigan Theater, gets millions of dollars, to be kept open, because it's connected and because people have deemed it to be historic.
Well, Tom, I'm going to give a little bit of pushback, play devil's advocate here. And it's not that I disagree with you, because you and I are very much on the same page. I'm sorry?
Do you agree with me because you are historic?
Well, I am about as much historic as a guy can get in this podcast. But But what I'm driving at is the claims for all of the economic multipliers. Okay, we're creating jobs, or we're bolstering jobs, or we're keeping jobs from going out of state. We're increasing the tax base. There are all sorts of the ripple effect of the economic multipliers, and that we're going to help all these smaller businesses that are around there, where the new employees are going to shop and they're going to spend their money and they're going to purchase homes that they pay property taxes on. And this will behoove the schools in the area and things like that. So how would you approach those arguments? Because I know I've had these conversations before with individuals such as James Holman at the Mackinac Center, and
I guess here's how I would approach it. If you're talking about the indirect jobs, is that the thing we're talking about?
Well, right. And all the economic multipliers that supposedly go along with that.
You brought up James Holman. I would point to his research that all of the companies that talk about the benefits of indirect jobs, to the point where it's so diluted that I don't believe those claims. In my opinion, the indirect jobs are just looking at one side of the slate, and that is, well, what would have happened if that money was directed to some other place, like a tax refund to taxpayers? Has anybody ever done? I've never seen in my life a tax cut indirect job, a study. It's always if government's giving money. So I've never put much stock in those studies, and go check with James Holman. Just about everybody now claims that you give them money and they'll spin gold with it.
Well, and the reason I posed the question, I guess it was kind of loaded, because I knew that you would kind of prick it with a pin and deflate a lot of those claims. So
that's what I do.
That's what you do. Okay, well, gentlemen, I think we're just about out of time. So I would like to thank Scott McClallen, who is the Center Square's Michigan correspondent, for being here. Thank you, Scott. And I would also like to thank because we have the great John Stife, I will say the great Tom Gantert, who is our editor at large for the Center Square. Thanks tons, Tom, for being here. Tom says, "You're welcome."
I nodded.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this is a podcast. This is a recording. People listen to these things. So Michigan in Focus is powered by the Center Square. It's a production of America's Talking Network, and you can find all of the Center Square's great podcast at americastalking.com. That's americastalking.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, we ask you to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. I'm Bruce Walker, Great Lakes Regional Editor of the Center Square Newswire Service. Listen for another episode of Michigan in Focus next week.